every time you switch, it seems to get frozen. All right, so we're continuing in Isaiah. We're in chapter 7 and 8, but now we're focusing on the prophecies here. We tried to go through the history a little bit. I'm going to review that for a couple of minutes just to give you an overview. These chapters are highly discussed and debated, so we're going to answer all those questions in like 15 minutes, then we can move on, and now we know all. No, I'm just going to lay out some of the ideas that people have. It's some difficult thoughts, and people have argued this back and forth, but I think that really the details are not so important as the bigger picture, and that's what I want to kind of focus on, not get lost in the weeds, but looking at the bigger picture of what's being predicted here. And obviously a big part of that is Isaiah 7:14, which is about the virgin will have a child named Emmanuel. And so that's really and that's why so much attention is paid to it, because it's such a powerful prophecy of the Messiah. All right, let's begin with a prayer. Thank you all for being here. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity you give us this morning to come together, to open your words, and to learn more about your great plan of salvation and the gospel message that has been prepared and laid out for thousands of years, especially through your prophets as they predicted many details about the coming of your Son and his salvation and the hope that we have in him. Help us as we worship you today to do so with open hearts, with humble hearts, and that we would grow in our faith and knowledge as we study your words. And also, Father, we ask that you would be with all those that are traveling, that they would arrive here safely, and for those that are unable to be here because of sickness or other problems, that you would be with them and that we would not forget them and we would reach out to them and encourage them throughout the week. We thank you so much for your Son. It's in his name we pray and give you thanks always. Amen. All right, so again, we've already gone through the history, and not that you necessarily remember everything, but I want to remind you of some of the geography of the region. If you look at the big picture here, you have several bodies of water, just to kind of give you again a picture of that area in your mind. You have the Mediterranean Sea, and then you have two bodies of water in the north and two bodies of water in the south. The Black Sea, which is just above modern day Turkey, and then you have the Caspian Sea over here. Below that's the Persian Sea, of the Persian Gulf, and then the Red Sea. So you've got this sort of this square of land. Assyria is the northern part. Here you have the Euphrates River and the Tigris River right here going up from the Persian Gulf. It's really coming down from here. You have the Euphrates and the Tigris River. And Assyria was over in this section, and then down at the bottom is Babylon, just kind of giving those two basic nations. In the land of the Jews, so I took that smaller area and put it over here. It's actually a different map, but it works out. You've got Sea of Galilee, Jordan, and the Dead Sea. Okay, and so you see the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. Egypt is down here. And then you've got the southern kingdom of Judah, with Jerusalem being the capital. You need to remember these names. Well, for these it's pretty obvious. The northern kingdom is Israel, with its capital of Samaria. Then you have Aram, or some Bibles would say Syria, but it really wasn't called Syria until much later. And its capital is Damascus. So those are the three players. And then, of course, Assyria that's going to come down and take this whole region during this period of time. So we have Isaiah is speaking to Judah and Jerusalem, the southern kingdom. And we saw in chapter 7 that Israel and Aram, or Samaria and Damascus, were coming and threatening Judah. This is the time. Now, Ahaz is king. Is Ahaz a righteous or a wicked king? Do you remember Ahaz? We talked about him. He's a wicked king. He doesn't trust in God. He's doing things his own way. And God tells him through Isaiah that you shouldn't be afraid of these two nations, because I'm going to deal with them. Assyria will come and deal with these two nations. And that's when we're looking at chapters 7 and 8. There could be several events taking place, and several children, or it could be the same event with the same child, and there's some difficulties there. And I don't think it really matters that much to the big picture. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on looking at the details here. But what we're basically saying is these two nations, Israel and Aram, are against Judah, and God says you don't need to worry about them. But I'm going to deal with them, and he's going to use Assyria to come down and to judge those two nations very soon. But the problem is Ahaz isn't faithful, so God's going to also allow a lot of damage to Judah. Judah's not going to get away without any problems. And then eventually Assyria is going to come against Judah and attack Judah and do a lot of damage to Judah through their different kings. But that'll come maybe 30 years later, where the real damage comes to Judah. So Assyria is going to come in and take away Israel and Aram, and then Assyria is going to come and do damage to Judah. And only because God's plan is coming through Judah, and the Messiah is through Judah, and perhaps maybe because they're not as wicked, that God's going to extend Judah's kingdom for another 100+ years. And then finally Babylon will take Judah. All right, so that's some of the basic history. Next one, and I've shown you these before. I want to give you a basic timeline again. And just to remind you, here's Isaiah prophesying during most of this period, maybe a little bit less than here, maybe a little less than there, but he's prophesying from the days of Uzziah all the way through the days of Hezekiah. And there's one verse that it could indicate that he actually went out a little bit further, but it doesn't really matter. We're looking right here when Rezin and Pekah, which is the king of Aram, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, the king of Israel, are going to come against Judah. And Ahaz and the people are very afraid. What should they do when they see an enemy attacking? What should their response be? What should any people in Israel or Judah be when they see an enemy coming? Excuse me?
Seeking the Lord's guidance.
Seeking God's guidance and strength and trusting in God. Would that be effective? Very effective. What are they doing? They're being afraid, and they're going to do it their way. And so this is the part that we really just need to understand, that God is coming to them. And I believe too, there's two passages in Isaiah, I'll talk more about this later, but there's two passages in Isaiah 7 and 8, that gives you a historical account of an attack, and then Isaiah 36 to 39 with Hezekiah. And it's really two different contrasts, I believe, because Ahaz is not faithful. Ahaz is not going to trust in God. And here's the consequences. And then Hezekiah, when he sees the enemy coming, he's going to respond very differently with faith and trust in God. And I believe there's a purposeful contrast there between these two historical points in Isaiah. Anyway, so we're just going to start reading, and again, I'm not going to get, if you want to make comments about the details, that's fine, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on some of the more difficult things. No, I don't. I'm okay, mostly. I used to, when I was like 10, I could read in any light. My father's like, how can you see with that light? It's like, I never understood that. Now I'm starting to understand that when you get older, you need more light. So, but I'm not there yet. Now it came about in the days of Ahaz, the son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, king of Judah, the Rezin, king of Aram, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, went up to Jerusalem to wage war against it. See, somebody's not convinced that I don't need the lights. All right, thank you. I appreciate that. It's a little subtle hint. Good. Verse 2. When it was reported to the house of David, saying, the Arameans have camped in Ephraim, his heart and the hearts of his people shook as the trees of the forest shake with the wind. Again, we're going to find out that that is not a sign of trust in God. They should be concerned, but they should turn to God. But they're just all afraid. So God says to Isaiah, go out now to meet Ahaz, you and your son Shear-Jashub, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool on the highway to the fuller's field, and say to him, take care, be calm, have no fear. Do not be faint-hearted because of the two stubs of smoldering firebrands, on account of the fierce anger of Rezin and Aram and the son of Remaliah. Because Aram with Ephraim and the son of Remaliah has planned evil against you, saying, let us go up against Judah and terrorize it and make for ourselves a breach in its walls and set up the son of Tabeel as king in the midst of it. Thus says the Lord God, it shall not stand, nor shall it come to pass. That is what God says. I will stop this. What should the people in Ahaz say? What should be their response? Yea, and we trust God. But that's not going to be the response of Ahaz and therefore Judah. By the way, it's interesting that this is part of the question. Here's Isaiah, and he's already got a son. So that's a part of the problem. If the other child is a child of Isaiah, then his wife is already a woman that has children. Unless he has another wife, and then people would talk about taking a second wife. There's actually some different things that people have to say about this. But he says in verse 7, it shall not stand, nor shall it come to pass. God is giving them reassurance they should trust that, but they don't. For the head of Aram is Damascus, the head of Damascus is Rezin. Now there's another point being made. Now within another 65 years, Ephraim will be shattered so that it's no longer a people. I want to say ahead of time, this is another verse that causes some questions. But here's this basic point, and it says within a few years, we're going to see Israel, and we're going to see Aram come to an end. But then it says Ephraim, 65 years, which is part of Israel. Well, what happens is Assyria comes and defeats Aram and Israel, but there's still people there, and Samaria was only taken a few years later, but there was a process of the defeat, but there was still a lot of Israelites left, and apparently it continued on down into the time over here, and this guy Ezarhaddon comes, and he takes the rest of the people, but he brings other people, and that's when the nation really came to an end. So I think it's looking at that period of the fall of Israel, but it was a process. But it would be completely done as a nation 65 years later. The other ones say a few years. So that would be the effective power of those two nations would be gone, but there was still some lingering things that had to happen. Verse 9, the head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is the son of Remaliah, which would be Pekah. If you will not believe, you surely shall not last. In other words, you need to believe what God tells you. You need to trust in God. Are they going to trust in God? No. So God says, and he spoke to Ahaz saying, ask a sign for yourself from the Lord your God. Make it as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven. This is a very unique statement. You don't see things like this anywhere else in the Bible. God is saying, I will let you choose the sign. You can have whatever you want. That's a pretty open statement. But Ahaz says no. No. And it sounds like, he says, I will not ask, nor will I test the Lord. That sounds some kind of noble, I guess. But the answer is clear that his heart is not saying, no, I don't need a sign from God. It's basically, I don't care what God says. I'm going to do things my way. So God says, listen now, O house of David. Is it too slight a thing for you to try the patience of men, that you will try the patience of my God as well? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin will be with child and bear a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel. And that means God with us. And then that's what's quoted in Matthew 1 about Mary. Before she has relations with Joseph, she's going to have a child. And that's where all the debate is. And let me just go back to that verse again when he says, I'm going to show you this sign. And it sounds like something really, really important. This great sign. And he says, no, I don't want a sign. God says, I'm going to give you a sign. What is God giving them a sign of? Well, the Messiah. So what would that be an assurance to them? Not only that there would be a Messiah, but they would continue as a people, because it was going to come through them. So this would be not just you're going to last as a people, but I'm going to fulfill all my purposes and my promises to you. So this would be are they listening? No. But this is a sign of God's ultimate trustworthiness and his ultimate giving of victory to them. And The virgin will be with child and bear a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel. Now, there's a lot of debate about the word virgin, because in Hebrew you can have this word Bethula, which literally means virgin. That's like a word that absolutely means virgin. This is another word, alam, which, and I have no idea how to pronounce these words, I just read them. But alam is a word that young woman, and it could mean a virgin. It usually means a virgin, but it doesn't have to mean a virgin. So people say, well, then it wasn't really predicting the virgin birth. But that word tends to be used as a virgin. And also, when that Old Testament Hebrew got translated into Greek, the Septuagint uses a word which means virgin. And when the Old Testament got translated into Latin, which is, again, that was after Jesus, but it uses a word which means virgin. But I think the Septuagint is the one that, and there's also a Syriac, which actually uses a word when it translates it, which is more like virgin. So it's not like, that word didn't mean virgin at all. It's just that it's a weaker word. It didn't really have the force of saying this woman will be a woman that never had relations and she's going to have a child. But I want to jump ahead to chapter 9. It talks about in verse 6. If you didn't have this, then maybe you could say, well, that was just added later in the story. Okay, they went back and they looked at that passage. It was literally going to be a virgin birth. Well, look at chapter 9 in verse 6. For a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us. So again, it's not just a child for Isaiah or a child for the king. It's going to be for all of us. All of them, I believe all of us too. A child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, the government will rest on his shoulders. His name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. There will be no end to the increase of his government or of peace on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish and uphold it with justice and righteousness from then on and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will accomplish it. You can trust this. This will happen. So this child that's going to be born, how is he described? How's he described, this child? Does it sound like an ordinary child? Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. Does that sound like an ordinary child? So even if you want to debate the word virgin in chapter 7, clearly this child is going to be very special. This child is going to be unique. And maybe they don't understand everything about it, but both these passages, when you put them together, you clearly see God is pointing to something a whole lot more special than just a child being born. All right. So the other question is, when you hear that this woman will give birth to a child, verse 14, and he will be named Emmanuel, well, then it says in the next verse, he will eat curds and honey at that time, at the time he knows enough to refuse evil and choose good. For before the boy will know enough to refuse evil and choose good, the land whose two kings you dread will be forsaken. This is not about a child that's going to be born 800 years later in the future, 700 years later in the future. It's about a child that would be born at that time, and then he grows, and before he really gets that old, what's going to happen? Those two nations are going to be dealt with. So this is clearly a prophecy about their time. And I think that the wording is such that it's going to point to, as a type, to point to who? It's pointing to Jesus. So it's still relevant, and that's where people start saying, well, is it really about that child, or is it about Jesus, or is it about both? And then there's a lot of confusion. Again, I'm not sure we can really resolve that, especially in a class for a half an hour. We're not going to, but at least there's questions about this. But the Bible does this a lot. Like, for instance, when David was told, you're going to have a son and he's going to build the temple. Who was that? Solomon. Oh, well, or was it? Who was it about? It's also pointing to Jesus, too. Now, again, was that a double prophecy? Was that a fulfillment in Solomon, and then Solomon becomes a type of Jesus? There's different ways of explaining it. But we know that it was true for Solomon, and we know it was true for Jesus. And maybe if we don't understand the exact idea, we know that there was clearly indicators for Solomon and clearly indicators for Jesus, because it says both, that it was pointing to both in the New Testament. So, and the Old Testament. So in Isaiah 7, this child will be born, and within a very short period, which sounds kind of surprising. What would happen to Aram and Assyria, who were Aram and Israel, who were threatening Judah? They would basically be so weak and you don't have to worry about them anymore. All right, what does it say? Before verse 16, before the boy will know enough to refuse evil and choose good, the land whose 2 kings you dread will be forsaken. The Lord will bring on you and your people. Now it's really telling what's going to happen to you. Because you didn't trust in me, because Ahaz and the people were not respecting God and believing in him and trusting in him, God is also going to bring upon you and your people such days as have never come since the day that Ephraim separated from Judah, the king of Assyria. So not only are you're going to escape Israel and Aram, they're going to do a lot of damage to you, but you'll escape them, but I'm going to bring Assyria against you, and they're going to add to your suffering because you didn't trust in me. And then that's really the end of the chapter. I'm not going to go through all the details. If you want to read, that's fine, but I'm just going to go down to verse 22. It will happen that because of the abundance of the milk produced, he will eat curds, for everyone that is left within the land will eat curds and honey. And it will come about in that day that every place where there used to be 1,000 vines valued at 1,000 shekels of silver, it will become briars and thorns. So all the cultivated, beautiful land is going to be destroyed. And we read some of the account of Tiglath-Pileser III, how he had his own records, and he said, I came against Damascus and I destroyed all the surrounding vineyards and orchards and everything. So that would be one of the things that they would do to weaken the nation. And which seems kind of strange, because then that would take away your potential revenue that you could take from everybody. But that was a way of keeping other people weaker, I guess, less prosperous. So what's going to happen? The land is going to be basically turned back to just land for grazing. So there'll be plenty of milk, there'll be plenty of bees, but there won't be the vineyards and the wealth that you had before. That's really the point of that. So now chapter 8. Do you have any questions about 7? I jumped over 7:14. I wanted to give time to people to have some points. Here, Robert.
I read somewhere the word virgin can also mean unmarried, which is kind of a
yeah, right.
And then the curds and honey just reminded me that's where there would be no prosperous time, that the abundance of those things, the lesser things, instead of bread and wine. So there's the destruction.
Yeah. There'd be something to eat, but it wouldn't be what you had. It wouldn't be those wonderful things that you had before, the vineyards and the everything was cultivated. Everything's going to be destroyed, and it's going to go back to the wild. Yeah. So you'll be eating, but it won't be as like before. All right. Anybody have any other comments or thoughts? Again, this section, there's a lot to say about it, but we have to get through all of Isaiah. So I'm trying to go through and just hit some of the key points. Chapter 8. The Lord said to me, take for yourself a large tablet, write on it in ordinary letters, swift is the booty, speedy is the prey. We'll find out that's actually a name, Maher Shalah Hashbaz. And so that's this name. I will take to myself faithful witnesses for testimony, Uriah the priest and Zechariah the son of Jeberai. Darrell was mentioned. He says, really? Uriah the priest? That was the guy that when Ahaz says, hey, high priest, I don't want you using the altar that God set up. I want you to build a idolatrous altar that I saw in Damascus, and I want you to set it up in Jerusalem. And he goes, okay. And he does it all. How is this guy a faithful witness? I don't know how to explain that, except for he was an official. He's one of the head people, so he would be, as an official, he would be able to give testimony as a witness, and they would see this. So it's really kind of weird when it says faithful witnesses. I think that doesn't mean it in the way we think, like in terms of being faithful to God, because Uriah didn't seem to be a faithful witness in that sense. But anyway, these people would bear witness. So I approached the prophetess. That approaching would suggest a polite way of saying having relations. I approached the prophetess, and people say, well, who is this prophetess? There's a debate about that. Is it Isaiah's wife? And because he's a prophet, she's kind of given that title? Or is it some other woman? I think it's just his wife. But again, I don't think there's a way to really prove this. I don't think it's that critical to the whole big picture. So I approached the prophetess, and she conceived and gave birth to a son. Then the Lord said to me, name him Maher Shalal Hashbaz, which is swift is the booty, speedy is the prey, which basically is saying, before this boy even grows up, what's going to happen? Assyria is going to come and take away all the spoil from Israel and Aram. They're going to lose everything very quickly, which is the same idea. So is this a different child or is this the same child? Some people, I think most people argue it's two different children, and maybe. But it's the principle is the same. What's going to happen very shortly, in a very short period of time, what's going to happen? Assyria is going to come, and these two nations you're afraid of, they're going to be humbled to the point where they're not going to be a problem for you anymore. That's the real point. So, verse 4, before the boy knows how to cry out, my father or my mother, the wealth of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria will be carried away before the king of Assyria. And again, I think it's just different language saying the same thing, but people go back to the other child, and he says before he knows enough to refuse evil and choose good. Well, they say, well, you have to be older to know evil and choose good, so this is probably somebody else, and the other one is just by saying mama or dada, that's shorter period of time. So maybe it's two different references, but again, you can spend some time studying it, and if it's what you want to do. So, but verse 4 is the point. Before the boy knows how to cry out, my father or my mother, the wealth of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria will be carried away before the king of Assyria. And again, the Lord spoke to me further, saying, inasmuch as these people have rejected the gently flowing waters of Shiloh. So now, the waters of Shiloh are in Jerusalem. So who is it that's rejecting the waters, the gently flowing waters of Shiloh? Well, it could be Aram and Israel, but that doesn't seem to fit the context. It's the people of Judah that are rejecting. So in verse 4, he says, you see these two nations? Before that child can cry out, my mother and my father, those two nations will be dealt with, Aram and Israel. Now he's saying, now I'm going to deal with you. Did they believe that? Did they trust that? No. So now what's going to happen? Same thing that chapter 7 says. Not only am I going to deal with these two nations very shortly, but I'm going to deal with you, Judah. And so now that's what we see in verse 5 and following. Again, Jehovah spoke to me further, saying, inasmuch as these people have rejected the gently flowing waters of Shiloah, and rejoice in Rezin and the son of Remaliah, which would be Pekah. They don't seem to want to use his name. They just say son of Remaliah. I think that's another way of distancing themselves from a wicked man. By the way, Ahaz's name, I was mentioning that last week. Ahaz's name was Jehoahaz, but that's like Jehovah and then Ahaz. So they kind of take away the connection with God, it seems. Anyway, and they rejoice in Rezin and the son of Remaliah. Now therefore, behold, the Lord is about to bring on them the strong and abundant waters of the Euphrates. Okay, where's Assyria? Way up on the Euphrates, on the other side of the Euphrates River. And so, what is he saying? It's like the river is going to overflow its banks, and it's going to pass through this whole area, and it's going to come down in verse the abundant waters of the Euphrates. By the way, the gentle waters of like the stream or the brook, those are nice waters, and that would be like God's kingdom, I think, and God's securing them. And then this abundant waters of the Euphrates, like tyrannical, powerful kingdom against them. Verse 7, therefore, behold, the Lord is about to bring on them the strong and abundant waters of the Euphrates, even the king of Assyria, in all his glory. And it will rise up over all its channels and go over all its banks. Then it will sweep on into Judah. It will overflow and pass through. So Assyria is going to come down into Judah and do damage to Judah later. It will reach even to the neck, and the spread of its wings will fill the breadth of your land, O Emmanuel. So this is going to come all the way through Judah and reach to the neck, which indicates that it's not going to quite finish Judah off, but it's going to do a lot of damage. And I believe we see that about 30 years later, right here, but then 30 years later, 701 BC, Sennacherib comes and basically does a big job on Judah and almost finishes Judah off until God says, enough. And what was does anyone remember the final event that stopped Assyria in their tracks? Kind of a momentous thing. What happened? What happened to an army of Assyria when they were getting ready to attack Jerusalem? Isaiah says they won't even shoot one arrow against the city. What happened? Yes?
100,000 men died.
Excuse me?
100,000 men died.
Yeah, 185,000 men died in one night by what? One angel. An angel came, and that was it. And then he went off home. He was humbled, and he never came back again. So that's we're going to get to that, chapters 36 to 39. And it's very important history, and I've got a bunch of archaeology connections with those chapters. Yeah.
So really, when you read Matthew, if they understood, which they should have recognized the prophecy, then they would have looked at the birth of Jesus as judgment. Because this is talking about judgment.
Yeah.
The sign is that I'm going to deliver you.
But there's consequences because you're not being faithful. You're not trusting these things. So yeah, indirectly, I think it's asking a lot, considering the other things that they didn't see. But yeah, I think that does point to judgment, doesn't it? It's just like when Jesus says, "You've made this temple into a robber's den." He's quoting Jeremiah. And what does Jeremiah say is about to happen to Jerusalem because they've turned the temple into a robber's den? You're about to be destroyed, like Shiloh. So implications are there, yes, because this was a judgment against them. It was really God preserving them, but it was still, there's going to be consequences to your rebellion. I'm going to do what I promise, but you're going to lose out on some of the blessings you could have had. So yeah, that's an interesting point. I doubt very much that they would have seen that, but because they missed the bigger picture, didn't they, about who Jesus is. So now, verses 11 and following, we know that this passage is quoted several times in the New Testament. So we know it's referring to the Messiah. And again, we've already seen in chapter 7 that a child will be born of a virgin and Emmanuel. And we're going to see that there's several passages here in this section that's referring to the Messiah. So we know that this section of Isaiah is pointing forward. It's talking about events of that time, but a lot of it is, again, God is with them. They should understand that. They should trust in God, but they're not. They're not faithful, and they're not trusting God's promises for the future or for the present. But God is constantly pointing to the future to show them, I will do everything I promised. And the most important things, obviously, are through Jesus. So, verse 11. I think we'll have enough time for this. For thus the Lord spoke to me with mighty power and instructed me not to walk in the way of this people, saying, you are not to say it's a conspiracy in regard to all that this people call a conspiracy. And here's the part. You are not to fear what they fear or be in dread of it. It is the Lord of hosts whom you should regard as holy. He shall be your fear. He shall be your dread. You're not to fear them. You need to fear God. Does that sound familiar?
Don't fear those who kill the body.
Who said that? Yeah, Jesus. Jesus uses language very similar, right? Don't fear man who can kill the body, but fear him who can destroy both body and soul in hell. See, we're supposed to fear God. And what were these people doing? They were busy fearing their physical enemies that are around them because they're not trusting in God. So that's kind of an important point. And so what is Isaiah being reminded of? This is not something that needs to concern you. This is all going to happen, but I'm in control. Don't fear them, fear me. And he says in verse 13, it is the Lord of hosts whom you should regard as holy. He shall be your fear. He shall be your dread. Then he shall become a sanctuary. And this is quoted in the New Testament about who? Who's the sanctuary? Who's the place of security? It's Jesus. Okay? In several passages, like Romans 9:33, he talks about Jesus as the sanctuary. But to both the house of Israel, a stone to strike and a rock to stumble over. Are they going to understand and respect the goodness of what God's going to do for them? No. And that's what's quoted in the New Testament, is they should have understood he was a sanctuary for them, but they would end up just stumbling over him and rejecting him. And of course, then that brings up the point, then really, what's this? Because they're going to act the same way, what's going to happen? Judgment's coming against them. Even though God's going to fulfill his promises, they're not going to benefit from them because they're not going to be faithful. And a snare and a trap for the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Many will stumble over them, then they will fall and be broken, they will be snared and caught. Bind up the testimony, seal the law among my disciples. And again, that could be going back to verse 2, when it talks about the witnesses. This is what's going to happen. Have witnesses there to account for this. But God is going to do what he promises in the future. All right, verse 17. I will wait for the Lord who is hiding his face from the house of Jacob. I will even look eagerly for him. Behold, I and the children whom the Lord has given me are for signs and wonders for Israel. This is quoted in Hebrews 2, and it's quoted about who? I and the children whom the Lord has given me. If we go to Hebrews 2, in verse 11, both he who sanctifies, that's Jesus, and those who are sanctified, that's the faithful followers, are all from one Father, for which reason he is not ashamed to call them brethren. So now Jesus is described as calling the faithful as brothers and sisters, brethren. Well, he quotes several passages. I will proclaim your name to my brethren. So it's showing that Jesus is describing the faithful as his brethren. In the midst of the congregation I will sing thy praise. That's in Psalm 22. And again, I will put my trust in him, and behold, I and the children whom God has given me. So Hebrews says that the one who was speaking back in Isaiah was really who? It was the Messiah speaking. And I and the children whom the Father has given me. Okay, so that's clearly the New Testament is pointing at this passage and saying that was speaking about Jesus and the Messiah. And then I think we have enough few minutes. I want to set up chapter 9, verse 19. When they say to you, consult the mediums and the spiritists who whisper and mutter. So what are people wanting when they're afraid? What do they start doing? They start looking for answers. Where are they going for their answers? Where are they trusting in? Yeah, this garbage of the world, the mediums, the spiritists. I want to say media, but that's okay. It's not media. Mediums, it sounds so weird. The mediums and spiritists who whisper and mutter. Should not a people consult their God? Should they consult the dead on behalf of the living? See, these people are not being faithful to God, to the law and to the testimony. If they do not speak according to this word, it is because they have no dawn. And verses 21 and 22, I think, is a really interesting picture. They will pass through the land hard-pressed and famished. Why would the people be suffering and hungry? They're not trusting in God. And God's going to allow them to suffer. So notice what's going to happen. What is that, by the way, what is that called when God does that? He oppresses, he lets them suffer. Is he doing it to be mean? What is it really meant to be? Chastisement or discipline. And he's doing it out of love and hope that they will learn from this. So, but usually when somebody gets disciplined, what are the two general reactions? Well, okay, defensive. I would say even worse than that. What's usually? Angry, bitter, rebellious. They dig their heels in, or they humble themselves. Those are the two choices, right? Well, think about this. They will pass through the land hard-pressed and famished, and it will turn out that when they are hungry, they will be enraged. So which direction are they going? The wrong way. And curse their king and their God as they face upward. They shake their fists at God because they're getting angry with God. They're not learning. They're not humbling themselves. They're getting angry. By the way, do people do this? All the time. And then they will look to the earth. I imagine, I don't know if this is exactly the way it is, but I can imagine they shake their fist at God and get angry, and they turn their back to him. And now what are they focused on? World and this life. So they're turning away from God. Where's that going to lead them? They will look to the earth and behold distress and darkness and the gloom of anguish, and they will be driven away into darkness. Isn't that what man does when he when he turns away from God. He gets angry and bitter, and he turns to the world, and it leads to nothing but gloom and anguish and darkness. And by the way, whose fault is it that he's suffering? It's their own fault. What do we see in chapter 9? What does God demonstrate? Incredible mercy. What's going to happen next? In verse 1, but there will be no more gloom for her who was in anguish. Why? Because they all learned and they all repented and they started being faithful? Not really, no. Who initiates this change? Well, God does. He reaches out, even in spite of their rebellion, he's going to reach out to them and he's going to bring them back to him. How does he do that? There will be no more gloom for her who was in anguish. In earlier times he treated the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali with contempt. But later on he shall make it glorious by the way of the sea, on the other side of the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who walk in darkness will see a great light. Those who live in a dark land, the light will shine on them. What is the light? This is quoted in Matthew. What's the light? It's Jesus coming to the world with this message of hope and blessings and holiness. And so what is he going to come to? He's going to come to a dark world. What is that telling you about the people? It was prophesied that when the Messiah came, would everybody be faithful? Now, they'd still be in rebellion. They'd still be turned against God. They're still suffering in darkness. But God in his mercy is going to send Jesus. And he's going to be the light. And what region is he going to be especially in? We're going to come back to this next week. But where would he be? Land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. Where's that? Whoops, got to back up on that one. I have another better map, a bit off to do. The Sea of Galilee, right around the Sea of Galilee. Where did Jesus spend all his time? Right around the Sea of Galilee. And so by the Sea of Galilee, in the land of the Gentiles, that's actually an interesting thing too. It's the land of the Gentiles. Isn't that the land of the Jews? Actually not. In the first century, it was not a land of the Jews. It was a land of the Gentiles. And it had been for many hundreds of years, the land of the Gentiles, because the Israelites got wiped out a long time. It was actually wiped out before this passage in Isaiah. The northern parts of that nation of Israel had already been taken away into captivity. But chapter 9, God is going to, even though people are in rebellion, God's going to bring light and blessings, and that's going to allow people to be drawn to God. And still, what are people probably going to do? They're going to reject the mercy of God, reject the Messiah. And so we all have that same choice, don't we? We can, when we're going through life and the problems of this life, we can get frustrated and angry with God, and we can turn our back against God and just be stubborn and head off into darkness and gloom and anguish and suffering. Or we can trust in God, and God will be there for us, and we can be blessed. And how do we ultimately understand how great God is and how trustworthy God is? He sent his Son. And that's really where it ends off, right? So this is about God bringing his Son. Remember verse 6 was, a child will be born to us. He'll be called Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. He'll sit on the throne of David, and the kingdom will be forever. These are all details of what God is planning for them in the future. Do they understand all that God's going to do? Is God going to do what they think or something far greater? It's always greater, isn't it? They have this idea of what God is promising, whether they believe or not. But God's going to do something far greater. All right, so next week we're going to look at chapters 9, and I don't know how much further we're going to get that. Maybe 9 and 10 at the most.